With the cozy, intimate audience tonight, let's give a round of applause to Mr. Rayyan with the microphone. And his new girlfriend, Elsa. That's great. It's been a few months. I haven't done a live episode, so I want to thank Neve and William sitting in the back for always allowing me to do this. And since we're still applauding, let's extend it to Tylor Brand. This podcast is made possible by the generosity of listeners and viewers like you. Kindly consider a contribution through Patreon or PayPal. Links are in the details box. Any amount is appreciated. And follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. The handle, The Beirut Banyan. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. And to stay updated with video releases, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks for listening, and thanks for watching. I'm Rani Shatar, and this is The Beirut Banyan.
Thank you so much for having me. I mean, this is a very short notice sort of event, so I appreciate you taking the time, and Neve and William for setting this up.
I read as much as I could from this fantastic book, Famine Worlds. Life at the Edge of Suffering in Lebanon's Great War. I'll start by emphasizing the book because it's not available yet in print at Aaliya's, but you can pre-order it. And I think you mentioned it's at AUB Bookstore?
It was at one point. I know that the one of the professors there had emphasized that the students should go and pick it up for one of their classes, and so they at least had some copies. And I know it's online, I think, at Antoine and Matt.
Yeah, I didn't see it physical copy at Antoine, but Antoine Library. And here at Aaliya's, I'll start by saying I do read quite a bit on Lebanese history. It's rare that I find a page turner. I was glued in.
Thank you.
And I think it's because you emphasize the human story. It's not a dry history book on the famine. And also it's storytelling. It's actually your own first-person narrative squeezed in.
Yeah.
And you're emphasizing, I think, what we're going through in retrospect and taking us back a century earlier. So I think that's the only way you can write about Lebanese history. So it's a great book. I'll emphasize this. Several topics that are painful to go through.
Yeah.
And I think maybe all the more so given that you started this journey right at the edge of our own recent cliff, and you watched this country collapse while you're writing a book about a century ago.
And I just missed, I want to say I was kind of like stumbling off the first couple of like edges before the fall.
Yeah.
I left here in 2015. I actually got my Ph.D. at the American University of Beirut. The first one since Naila Kaidbe in 1995. And so, being able to experience that
every 20 years, AUB produces a PhD.
I mean, we're going to be coming up on the anniversary to start getting people in there soon. So
okay, good.
But they're opening up the program again, so if someone is
excellent.
But yeah, being there as the Arab Spring hits, and you have the elation, and then suddenly the sort of kind of like withdrawal, and then especially once the Syrian war happens and the crisis hits, the terror and all the suffering that begins spilling over not just within Syria but then into Beirut as well.
Yeah.
And that was, I think, one of the more tragic aspects, I think, of my time here, being able to see that on the streets. And of course it's continued, and in many cases, I guess, gotten, if not worse. I mean, it's going to be there.
You mentioned up front in the book, I don't remember if it's in the preface or introduction, where you're watching demographics change in front of you, where you're seeing refugees from Syria initially embraced to a large extent, not by all, but from the majority, embraced and multi-class embrace. So it's not just the rich that are paying rent, it's the poor as well. It's the downtrodden. And you also watch that attitude shift quickly. Yeah. So I like that this is a book that's relevant to today. And it's also, I think, and I'll try to quote and not misquote, I'll try to remember the quote. It's something along the lines of that, this is not a repetition per se. but there's echoes throughout the story and multiple ones. And I think this is really what the book is emphasizing. It's that echo.
Yeah, and it's very hard. I mean, when you're writing a history book, you don't want to write the present into the past because, you distort the past, and, you don't want to make assumptions also about the present based upon what we interpret from the past. But finding those echoes, or even finding sort of kind of common themes that talk about the humanity. And really, this book was trying to be about the humanity. Like you mentioned, the stories and the narratives. You read famine books, and I don't think, perhaps one of the reasons why very few people carry books on famine is that they're not really that fun to read. Like, they're horrifying, and we tend to play up the horrific aspects of that, and it dehumanizes the people who suffer. And we really focus on the suffering. And the suffering is certainly there, but it's a bigger experience than that.
You also talk about your own relationship to the suffering too, that you adjust.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very quickly as well.
Yeah, it's been an interesting thing, I think, to even... I teach sometimes aspects of this as well. I'll have certain sources, and I'll bring them to class, and you talk to students. And what I was actually... I've taught the history of disease and disaster at the AUB several... actually started here. I keep teaching it in Trinity, where I teach right now. And every time I bring these things in, especially when I came here in 2022, I taught in one of my colleagues' classes at AUB, and we read a story by Huntington Bliss about essentially his own sort of encounters with people and how it twisted him inside as an observer. I mean, he was an observer kind of looking down on this, but he was also there. He was on the streets, people literally came to his house begging for him to save them, and he couldn't. And the sort of emotional turmoil that it puts him into, despite the fact that he himself is not starving, he'll never starve. He is, one of the most privileged people in society. His name is Bliss. But you still have that sort of kind of element there that has to be factored in.
I'm going to quote a quote from the book. I think it's the beginning of the introduction. It's from Antun Yamin. So I love this quote. Shame on you who do not record for us the scandal, the disgrace, so that we can fight against the oppressors and blacken the pages of the lies of those greedy ones from among the sons of this miserable nation.
His entire introduction was full. You have to be very... It took a long time to pick out exactly which one I would use for that.
That's the most optimistic one.
I don't want to say optimistic, but...
No, but actually it opens the subject, I think, to several talking points. I have to admit, I didn't get the chance to finish. I skimmed through what I could on short notice.
Yeah, perfectly. I mean, take your time later. It's fine.
I hope I can steal the physical copy as well.
This one is actually already spoken for, but
really?
I'll just try to ensure that you get one.
PDF file.
Yes, exactly.
Stick to PDF. So I'm going to count on you to guide the terrain as much as you'd like. I'll interject when I think it's necessary.
Yeah.
But you're the expert on this subject. I know very little about the famine itself. So I'm going to turn to you for more details. Let's begin with adaptive strategies. So surviving in the face of an astute economic crisis and social despair and outright collapse a century ago. What were those adaptive strategies, the way you saw it?
So the interesting thing about famine, we have to start off, I guess, defining really what famine is and what it's not. We often think about famine as there not being any food. And it's very rare that you get a famine where there's nothing there. In most cases, famine is really an economic circumstance. Either the prices are too high, wages are too low. In the case of Lebanon during the war, it was a combination of the two. And it was created by the very unique circumstances of World War I. Without the war, you wouldn't have had the famine. I mean, you had things like locusts coming in that ate significant chunks of the cover of the book. And this would have created some pressures on the system. But in the end, the food was there. In fact, there was allegedly 2 years worth of food stored in the khazanas in Damascus and in the Orontes Valley. Beirut had its own warehouses. There was food. But
you described Syria and Iraq as breadbaskets, so there's actually ample food.
Yeah. And they, of course, continue producing. But with the war, of course, you need to feed the war. And each Ottoman soldier, and eventually they recruited something like 2.8 million of them, have to eat, roughly 3 meals a day. They didn't get it, of course, towards the end of it, but over time this adds up, and it's directed away from civilians because nobody knew how long the war was going to go. So for civilians, you're stuck with what's ever left over. So many of the adaptive strategies really were just trying to get themselves fed in some way or another. Most people in Lebanon relied heavily upon wheat at this point. About, I think, estimation from Afif Thanous was around 85% of one's daily diet was wheat. So the first thing, of course, that goes to the army is wheat. And the price of wheat skyrockets at the end of 1915. So what do? No, you don't starve to death, of course. You just transition to different sorts of foods, and oftentimes you eat less of it.
Yeah.
And what food is available oftentimes through the government distribution networks is corrupted in some way or another because they need to stretch it as much as possible. And because people are trying to make some money off this as well, they're going to put things like, say, flour, chalk, dirt, dangerous things sometimes. So people did eat things and try to approximate normal stuff. You might read stories about black bread, for instance, and there's actually even some images of the black bread out there, and they look like bits of coal, essentially. But for many people, this was also something that was even difficult to live on. So you might live on things that are even cheaper. The price list suggests things like, say, pulses, like lentils in particular. You might shift to something like that. At certain times of the year, you can go and forage for herbs. If you have access to animals. So Sarah was telling me a story about they're literally one goat keeping a family alive. These things you have that you can kind of take the edge off often were the difference between life and death. And if you didn't have something like that, then you're utterly dependent upon essentially your community or your lack of community. And over time, you have general malnutrition, and people can live for years like this. You're talking about a famine that lasted 3.5 years.
If I remember right, there's little expectation of this turning into a bigger story. The way you write it, at least in the introduction, that people are adjusting always.
Yeah.
So this is not, there's no indication that this will end in famine.
Yeah. And if you think about it, we retrospectively look back on World War I, and it's seems so obvious that this is going to turn into this massive turmoil that changes the world. And we can think about the kind of like the nostalgic sort of remembrances of we'll be home by Christmas, the politicians saying. Yeah. And the generals, of course, knew this was a lie, and they were not going to necessarily believe that. But at the same time, the Ottomans didn't have any sense for how long it was going to go. And really, if the Ottomans had fallen at Gallipoli, then the war would have ended.
Yeah.
It would have taken Lebanon and Syria out of the war. And without the war, of course, you would not really have had the famine. There are a lot of these sort of interesting counterfactuals that kind of pop up around this time. But because the Ottomans knew that if they lost the war and they'd been on the side of the Germans, the empire was broken apart, this was existential for them. And so I think one of the difficult things when we look at this is you have the different sort of interests conflicting so vividly in such a terrible sort of way. If there's a sense that this is getting too bad for the civilians and we have to pull out, then maybe thousands of lives get saved.
Yeah.
But, they hung into the very bloody end, and here we are.
So I'm going to take myself back to AUB history courses that I took maybe 2 decades ago or so. I don't know if Salim Deringel sounds familiar.
Of course, yes.
Do you know him? Yeah.
He was my former colleague, actually, at the AUB later on.
Okay. Oh, so he joined when you were there?
Yeah.
Okay, I took a course with him, I don't remember when, maybe 15 years ago. He was a visiting professor.
Yeah.
Maybe longer than that, actually. He wrote a book, Ottoman Twilight.
Yeah.
Sort of the turn of the century.
The memoirs of the Turkish soldiers and things. Yeah.
Right. And this phrase stuck with me. I've heard it in different places. This confluence of crises.
Yes.
I don't know if that... that may actually be word for word from the book.
Uh-huh.
So that confluence in 1914, the way it's written at least is that this is an unexpected disaster. World War I is not anticipated, obviously. And then you have a curious character like Jamal Pasha. So that kind of, the reputation he earns later is one thing, but that moment where things are on the brink.
Yeah.
Can you take me back to that kind of, that narrow window, 1914, as World War One begins, what Beirut is already going through, and the change, the political change that leads to, I think, economic disaster.
Yeah. I mean, I think that when you're initially starting the war off, you have Johannes Pasha Kyumjin up in the mountains, Mutsarraf. He is very sympathetic to the Lebanese cause, to the extent that he is essentially kind of accused of being I don't want to say a collaborator, but he did not get along well with Jamal Pasha and the triumvirate, and left.
Is that the last Mutasarrif, or the second? One of the last.
He's one of the last independent ones, technically.
Yeah, right.
Because then after that, you have a couple of Ali Munaf, who kind of goes out under a cloud for allegedly stealing. Oh, not allegedly. There's apparently some very credible sort of sources suggesting he was part of this like theft of grain from the Lebanese wheat company, which was supposed to be given out to people to save their lives. And then you have Ismail Haki Bey, and you have he was actually generally a pretty good one as far as Mutasarrifs go. And then you have
this one's the last independent one, meaning pre-World War One.
Pre-World War One, before the Ottomans directly intervened and then kind of made the Mutasarrifiyat and actually controlled by Istanbul rather than part of the.
Could you say his name again? Just you said it quick.
Ismail Haki Bey, or
Ismail Haki Bey.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So when 1914 hits, of course, for the most part, Mount Lebanon usually was somewhat exempt from a lot of these call-ups and things. Like you didn't have, and the Ottomans, because of various sort of kind of racial assumptions about things, one didn't particularly like having Arabs in their army, and also as a linguistic thing. Turkish soldiers didn't speak Arabic, and so they needed to be able to command their soldiers. But for this war, they needed to have everyone. And even at this point, also the Christians wound up getting conscripted as well. So in the Wilayat of Beirut, you had agents coming through and essentially collecting people, bringing them off, sending them off into the army. And it was actually really bad because the Ottomans, of course, had been fighting wars since 1911. You had the Italian War starting 1911, 1912. You had the Balkan Wars after that. The empire was exhausted. They were broke. They didn't really have any sort of desire to be doing this. But this was a different type of war. So they go and collect men, and you have, of course, the famous Safar Barlik, which is the collection of men and also the kind of provisioning of the army. And so a number of laws that were passed in 1914 let the Ottomans come in and basically just take whatever they needed for the wartime effort. And Kamal Salibi actually has in his little book on Hamdun a discussion about family members and people he knew having Ottoman soldiers coming in and taking not just the grain and the wheat, but also like taking a purse from one of his family members, and people trying to hide things just to have stuff left over afterwards. And this is, of course, terrible timing because, essentially this is taking place. You're talking about like October, November, at a time when, of course, people are trying to stock enough food up to keep them from having to purchase expensive food in the wintertime. If you don't have cash because the soldiers have taken that, if you don't have food set aside, and your husband or your sons or both are now off, being taken to potentially die on the front lines, you're leaving behind, women, families, elderly people who don't have any means of supporting themselves. So poverty begins kicking in at the end of 1914. And the first real migrations to the city start taking place in early 1915. People begin...
From the Mutasarrifi to Beirut.
Yeah. So the mountains, and the same things happen, of course, in Zahle and Tripoli, anywhere that's kind of near the mountains.
Yeah.
People will go to an area that has greater economic gravity because it will always pull supplies. It will pull jobs. And so, with the blockade that winds up getting set up by the Entente forces, the silk industry is shut down. The Beirut port is shut down. There's really no work for people. And so in the major cities, you have lots of underemployment. In the mountains, the silk industry is gone, so you have underemployment. There's no finances coming in because the Ottomans don't want their entire treasury transferred back to Britain and France because the Ottoman Bank was, of course, a British and French institution. So in blocking off then any transfers of money, any remittances that might be coming in, of course, are gone too. And the Mahjar was, of course, a really important source of income at this point. It was about 41% of Mount Lebanon's income, or GDP at least, as it was recorded. So the things that had sustained society were no longer really viable at this point. And this is even before you really can call it a famine.
Yeah.
Like, you don't have people starving in the streets yet, but there's a lot of pressure just to stay alive and just kind of keep one's head above water. As early as 1914. The end of 1915, it turned into a much deadlier and much worse sort of situation.
So that window, if you could, just from poverty to famine, is there could you narrow down those political moments, let's say? Is it Jamal Pasha who's directly involved in the paralysis turned, complete disaster?
So Jamal has, of course, the worst reputation of possibly any historical figure in Lebanese political history, which is saying an awful lot.
Worse than Nabih Berri.
I mean, we're really kind of like...
No, I know. I mean, that's what I know. It is. It is worse than Nabih Berri, yeah.
Yeah. It's a
like
man who's earned the nickname, the bloodshedder, the butcher.
No.
And a lot of it partially is the reputation he was very happy to cultivate. If you read his memoirs, which are actually in French and English, he wanted to come off as this like powerful, gruff, grim sort of figure to scare people.
Yeah.
There's a really interesting, in the AUB 150 anniversary volume, let's see, Maysoon Sukaria and Tarif Khalidi have a really wonderful sort of overview of like this kind of like stories that are told about this one particular like kind of bandit off in the Dakar Valley, Milham Qasim. And did you get to those points in the book?
No, Tarif Khalidi was my supervisor.
So you probably have heard some of these.
Yeah, I've heard them in person, yeah.
With his storytelling ability.
With his very unique way of storytelling.
Yes. So
can I just interject here?
Please, yes.
So AUB history department or political science, the overlap.
Yeah.
He's the only professor I know that got away with smoking in his office.
Next to the no smoking sign.
Right underneath. He would smoke towards it.
He opens the window though. He
opens the window, that's true. And he had a what are they called? These portable watches? I forgot what they're called.
Yeah, the chain ones.
Pocket watch. He had a pocket watch. Whenever in class he felt like leaving, he would open the pocket watch and say, "Oh, time for a break." It never moved. It was a still pocket watch, and that was great. He always got away with a break. He's like, "Oh, it's time for a break." That doesn't even work. No, he's the only person I know that checks his email still. TK00. I remember this from 25 years ago. Yeah. Anyway, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah. But Jamal, of course, within these stories is like, I mean, some of these events may have happened. Most of them probably didn't. These are probably just kind of apocryphal things. But Jamal Pasha served as this like, he was like the big bad of the stories. Like, and he always was kind of like the sort of the arbiter of whatever sort of like, lesson you're supposed to get at. There's one story when Milham Qasim showed up in his office, and for some reason Jamal wanted to see him. Jamal brings him in, and he has his soldiers next to him. Qasim's tied up to a chair, and somehow Qasim miraculously rips free of his bonds, grabs a chair, and pins Jamal Pasha, who is about the size of this glass right here, to the floor, and he's threatening to kill him. And Jamal is like, "Okay, I respect you, and I'm going to let you go." And so they became buddies in the stories after this. And, the way it's written, of course, Tarif's personality kind of comes out in this. And he keeps popping up in the stories. Jamal is a recurrent character because people, when they hear these stories, know it. Like, they know him. They know he is the scary guy. He's the guy who's hanging the people in Martyrs Square, giving us Martyrs Square.
That's true, yeah.
So he brings someone in. This person's wanted for some crime, and because Milham is now like Jamal's buddy, he thinks like, I can, advocate on his behalf. And so, he comes, and Milham's like, "No, would you forgive this guy and let him go free?" And Jamal's like, "For you, I'll do that." And so the man gets down on his knees and crawls over to Jamal and like starts kissing his hand. And Milham reaches out and kicks him in the butt and says, "You're with me. Like, you don't grovel in front of anyone." And these are fascinating stories. You can kind of like take little bits and pieces from them. But when we get to the actual Jamal too, the stories themselves are still very important. Like, many stories that people hear about Jamal, again, may not necessarily have happened. There's a story about, Jamal and Enver Pasha, or just Jamal, or Azmi Bey, depending who's telling the story, going through the Bekaa Valley, and you have Sadnail, and people start surrounding him and pelting him with this black bread. That's like the notorious black bread, and saying, like, what you've reduced us to, like, And it's been reported in Yamin and a couple other ones. And there's another story that kind of like captures what people want Jamal to be, I think. And it's been told a number of times in different parts of the mountain. But Jamal goes to a village and sits down, and with a group of the people in the village, and they say, "You need to help us. There's a famine."
Yeah.
And so Jamal sits back and he says, "Well, has a mother eaten her child?" And the villagers.
So there is already blame towards him even during World War One.
Even during World War One. And I mean, you can read, like, say, for instance, the Diary of Edward Nicolay, who talks about, in certain cases, sort of like what he feels is a retributional sort of thing, because of the politics of Mount Lebanon prior to the war and the politics of the Maronite Patriarchate, that the Turkish military and Jamal Pasha in particular were targeting them for extermination, essentially, at the same time the Armenian genocide was going on as well. And the sort of parallels between the two were not difficult to miss. In 1916, 1917, of course, the Armenians had been essentially expelled down and were now actually taking up residency in Beirut and Aleppo and Damascus in the hundreds of thousands in certain cases. So, the Christian population being so obviously targeted in other places made, the famine, which was... the Ottoman responsibility for it was more overlooking the good of the population, I'd say, in many cases. Poor planning, poor execution, corruption, profiteering and working with profiteers. The state, instead of ensuring justice and protecting the population, in essence, allowed the system to fall down. And in part, this is also because the people who are tasked with enforcing things at the ground level were being paid a salary in Ottoman lira that had lost about 5 times its value by the time you get even to 1917. Soldiers were not being fed, and these are the people guarding checkpoints. So how are they going to feed themselves? Well, by corruption. Who are the ones who pay for this? The people on the ground, who, of course, are the connection points between the state and the soldiers.
It's at the beginning of the book. You describe various forms of famine, geographic almost differentiation.
Yeah.
So you have the urban version. Mm-hmm. You have the mountain, Mutasadafi. You also have the hinterland famine. Yeah. Could we go into those maybe at a pace that makes sense? I know each one has its own story.
Yeah.
But just a question off the top, and I have to remember now, Mutasadafi doesn't officially dissolve until 1918. Is that right? 1990?
It transitions to a direct control. I mean, in 1918 it was gone, but it was kind of absorbed into the Ottoman administration.
Right.
But Jamal Pasha had become the sort of kind of overseer, like the military governor of the entire region.
Of the entire region.
And the Mutasadafi was part of that. His headquarters was in Damascus and Aaliya.
Right, yeah.
So
that, I guess, under his rule, could we go into the nuance of what it's like to be, let's say, in Beirut or Tripoli or Zahri? Yeah. What it's like to be in a mountain village, and what it's like to be in a valley trying to survive.
Yeah. So it really depends on where you are and what your population is, really. If your population depends heavily upon, for instance, the case of Beirut, the port. The port made Beirut into a prosperous, thriving city. 1820, Beirut had 6,000 people, and it was just like that. I mean, you're the Beirut expert, and you know these things.
I ask questions like I don't know the answer. That's exactly kind of part of what you do after years and years. No. Yeah. 6,000 in 1820?
According to Shah Zaisawi's records.
Wow. And it's less than 100,000 at the turn of the century.
And then it bumps up to either 120 or 150, depending on the sources, around World War I. Because of course, the census data is really bad because you're not including people who are coming down from the mountain who are still registered up in Mount Lebanon.
But 6,000 is very small. I didn't know it's that small. 1820.
Yeah. So it was 6,000 from 1820 to 60,000 in 1860.
Right.
It was a boomtown, though.
Yep.
It benefited so much from the investment from abroad, the French investment through financing the silk trade, silk exports, which it fluctuated, but it gave you a cash economy, which is very important. On the other hand, you have massive amounts of imports coming in from Britain to take advantage of the wealth in Damascus, and primarily Damascus, but also in Aleppo as well. And so, the lifeblood of the city was the port. There's not really a lot of places to grow wheat around here. You can grow fruits, which were, of course...
he left, but Muhammad Shama, I did an episode with him about the port itself expanding under Ottoman rule.
Yeah.
And that's when the population grows. It really takes off.
Yeah. And so because it's really the center of economic activity, as soon as the Entente shuts down that entire port ecosystem, it's not just, of course, the ships coming in and the trade itself. This boils down to people's actual jobs. I mean, if you talk about shipping, like who is affected by the shipping? You have the porters who take things off the ships. You have the lawyers. You have the businessmen. You have the financiers. You have the people transported into the interior part of the country. So all of these people suddenly lose their jobs. And the people who have money, of course, begin thinking about other things to do with it. So speculation comes out of this. So it's kind of like a sort of knockdown effect that begins taking place. You have unemployment, underemployment, and as we get into then the famine of the mountain, you have the effect then of migration. So in the mountain, you have a similar situation. Mount Lebanon had become basically a cash-based economy, primarily on silk monoculture. And you had other things like fruits being grown in certain areas, and but for the most part, the silk industry and remittances were where most of the wealth was coming in. So again, you cut off any trade coming in and any trade coming out. You cut out the financial sort of transactions taking place. So no French investments in the silk industry and no remittances coming in. And suddenly a significant chunk of the money that people depended on to live was gone. So what do people do?
Well, these are the eerie comparisons. I think that's what that's what I took from the beginning of the book. That's the very eerie recent memory. So sorry to interrupt.
No, of course, no. So what suddenly happens, of course, is you need to have some way of supporting one's family. And so those who weren't pressed into military service then had to go and try to get jobs because at this point, for a woman to try to get a job that would pay enough to feed her family was absolutely almost impossible. In the agricultural sector, a woman working in the fields would get paid maybe 1/4, if she was lucky, of what a man would make. Even her son, who might be like a teenager, basically a child, would still, because of his gender alone, be getting paid more. And so what would often happen was you'd send the men down to the cities to go and try to find work. And so this, of course, then leaves no great amount of uncertainty. How do you get the money back up? How do you get work? And in many cases, there were no jobs because, of course, people in the cities couldn't get work either.
Right. Yeah.
So in the mountains, you have almost no financial support, no economic gravity, and the Ottomans, to prevent smuggling, set up checkpoints along the outsides of the mountain so that people brought food in. They would have to have a wasika that was, something that most people would kind of bribe their way into as well. So if you were poor, you didn't have access to that. You had to get it in some way or another. You had to bribe. You had to sneak it through smuggling. So people get very crafty about this. But at this point, you had many people getting into the cities, flooding the streets of Beirut, Tripoli, Zahle. And with this concentration of humanity, too, in intense poverty, in living in terrible circumstances, this is a fertile ground for disease. And this is where typhus comes in. We'll get to that in a little bit, I think.
There's some dark stuff we're going to cover, actually. that's one.
Sorry, I apologize.
All the notes tonight are actually quite bleak. I'm trying to
The whole thing is quite bleak.
Yeah.
So
even the locusts are dead.
Yeah. So you get to the countryside then, and you would imagine that being in the countryside, you would be better off because, of course, you're growing your food there. But there were a lot of things that made it very difficult. One, some of the most impoverished people in the entire region were, of course, peasant farmers. Many of them lived under circumstances where they essentially either didn't own their land or owed a significant amount of their crops to their landlord. For tax purposes, this might amount to about 40% per year, and the landlords might take an additional amount on top of that, or if they're not necessarily even a landlord, perhaps it would be just a prominent individual who's, owed a sort of kind of a due. So this would be difficult enough. And in fact, the farmers may have benefited by the fact that the price of food had gone up significantly. But for many of them, they actually didn't have the rights to their own crops. Many of them were indebted every single year just to be able to get the seed. And so they had to pay this off initially to whoever had given them the loan before they even could get anything out of the situation. And then we can think back also to what had happened at the start of the war, the conscription campaign. So who are they conscripting? Well, primarily young men in the countryside. They would send agents through and they would pick people out from these different villages. And particularly actually in areas in Janub, you would have entire like villages essentially plundered of men. Around Sur, there's about a 3.5 to 1 female to male ratio by 1916. And more people, of course, wound up being taken into the military after that. And in one village, and I could not find the source so it didn't make it into the book, someone had mentioned there was 11 to 1 female to male ratio by the end of the war. So socially, this is devastating. So the Ottomans began putting into programs to press women into the fields, take elderly women and men, train them in agriculture, force them into the fields for 8 hours per day.
That's during the war itself.
During the war itself, because the production was needed.
Yeah.
And so, and for many of these people too, they didn't have the rights to what they grew. They would be taken and sold at market towns. So there's stories about Mohsen al-Amin, who was a sheikh in Chakra. And so to get the food he needed to feed his family, he had to walk about 24 kilometers past fields to Nabatieh, to the market town, which was, controlled by one of Jamal Pasha's sort of allies from Damascus and apparently very corrupt, and, purchase food at exorbitant rates and then bring it all the way back to his family, again, walking through these fields where that food was grown. So the basic economics of the situation and the way that it's manipulated, speculation, profiteering, and things like this, it made a terrible situation all the more deadly for people.
It's an interconnected famine in that sense.
Yeah, very much. I mean, and that's the thing. Everything was so interconnected because, push forces out of the mountain, of course, resulted in people moving into the cities.
Yeah. Let's get into that, actually. You mentioned, was it typhoid? Was that the disease?
Typhus. No, it's typhoid too.
Sorry, yeah.
Which is also awful. But typhus was really the big one. You think about World War I, you think about, death and disease. There's usually two things that pop into mind. There's plague, which I mentioned this actually with some frustration earlier today. There's you tend to read through things and people say,
there's excellent dinner company when people go out and we're talking about, famine and death.
I'm not invited out to many places.
Yeah. That's you end up alone at the restaurant just talking to the owner,
Well, even they will leave me too.
Even they leave you. And the food's out anyway.
Yeah, exactly. But you read about, there's always, plague is always something that pops up in these kind of like more superficial sources about the famine. And there were 2 cases of plague that were reported during the famine, both in Antilias. And it was at a flour mill, and it was a man and his daughter. And, rats are attracted, of course, to grain. Yeah. And, apparently there was some plague-infected fleas that probably got there even before the war had gone.
But this is a consequence of overcrowding due to mass influx from Mount Lebanon, the Mutasarrifi, into cities. Is that the...
In essence, it was the movement of people. So the concentration of people in the movement. And I mean, nobody's eating, I don't think. Okay, good. So everyone at this time had lice on them constantly. Many people had worms as well. It was a very parasitic sort of situation. If you didn't have the ability to purchase, like, say, enough charcoal to heat your clothing, to actually sterilize it properly, people pass lice back and forth very easily. They'd get into your clothes, they'd lay their eggs in the clothes get on your body, the warmth will hatch the eggs. Eventually people are going to start scratching themselves. So normally this is fine because lice are just an irritation. You might get some rashes or something, but that's about it. But because you had a movement of soldiers from the Balkans where typhus is endemic, coming back in 1913, you initially had actually an outbreak in 1913 in Palestine, but it only became epidemic as a result of the crowding, the poor conditions, and the sort of kind of like the fuel that was added to the fire.
Right. So
typhus had been present in Beirut, although people assumed it was a new disease. Like they called it military fever because they saw it being connected to this. But if you go back to Benoit Boyer, who he worked here, and the French had kind of the city of Beirut had kind of brought him on to kind of do an overview of the sanitation in the city back in 1897. And he had gone through and listed out all the different sort of cases of disease that had popped up in one particular sort of kind of governmental set of clinics. And he actually found a number of typhus cases. So it was there. And we actually know it was there too because boy actually died of typhus, which is an excellent proof, if I can imagine one.
Well, could you describe that kind of scene? Let's say in Beirut. Is it literally people dead on the street?
By 1916 to 1917, yeah.
So there's bodies of just disease-ridden corpses and people starving as well.
Yeah.
And the book touches on this. I didn't get too far into this section where it's the social attitudes are changing as well.
Yeah.
So let's go there as much as we can.
That's the one that really makes you feel bad.
Yeah. Let's see. I mean, that's why I can't wait to get into it. No, I mean, the story is very bleak, but I said it already and I'll say it again.
Yeah.
It's the way you write that makes it a pleasure to read. Otherwise, it's a very painful journey through rot and hell.
Yeah.
But let's talk about the social attitudes.
Yeah.
Let's say you're in Beirut, typhus, all types of diseases, starvation, the social attitudes and how they change.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing I think to think about is the fact that famine is not something that is like, it's not aesthetically pleasing. If you see someone who's starving, and if even just looking at images online for something like this, it sticks with you. It's transformative. It is one of the most painful situations that one has to endure. It's one of the most horrific disasters that mankind can go through. And to see someone in the throes of famine, and we see this nowadays on Twitter in Gaza, and the sort of suffering the Palestinians are going through over there, it's heart-wrenching for you if you see it. And initially, this was something that was very apparent if you look in the sources. One of the contemporaries of the famine who wrote about this, several years later, Georges Khoury al-Makdisi, talked about, in 1915, you would walk through the streets, and if you saw someone falling down from hunger, everyone would rush over there. They'd pick him up, they'd sit him down, they'd give him some water, some food, and some dirhams, and they'd make sure he was good, and then they'd send him on his way. And Makdisi wrote, by 1916, you would walk through the streets and you'd have people lying in the gutter on either side of you, men, women, and children, reaching out a hand and begging desperately for someone to save them. And he said that we would just walk past them as if they weren't there. So
within months, really, that shift it's dramatic.
Yeah, and it's probably a number of different things. And it's something I think that's, it was really the thing that kind of twisted my book in this direction when I started writing about it. This is supposed to be an environmental history, and that didn't happen because I remember walking through the streets and just seeing the people around me, and you, after seeing like 5 people, 6 people, 7 people, 8 people on your way to class, lying in the streets and begging, and it was just sort of scenes of desperation and sadness. It would strike you, but you just would kind of you would walk. You wouldn't make eye contact. And nowadays, I still walk in the streets, and you can still see people doing that. It's survival mechanisms. And I was like, I am an awful human being. I'm exactly like these people that I'm reading in my stories. And after a year and a half of these sorts of things, people just kind of keep on going. The people who are around, the people who, in a technical sense, do have the ability to kind of reach out and improve the lives of the people around them, of course, aren't thinking about that sometimes. They're maybe thinking about, I have to get to work. I need to go do this one thing. Life goes on for them as well. And you have this sort of increasing distance between the impoverished, suffering people and the rest of society. One thing I was trying to get across in this too, and this is something I guess that was kind of came out in the title, Life at the Edge of Suffering. It's not just the people suffering themselves. It's the people standing at the edge of the suffering that's taking place, who are part of that in some way or another, who are impacted by it, but who don't themselves actually suffer in a physical sort of sense. And the fact that a starving person, especially one who is starving in the streets, is desperate. They don't care about bathing or anything. What they're trying to do is just to eat. There are stories about them rooting through the garbage just to find something edible. Digging through donkey dung. Going to the butcher's areas and sucking marrow and bits of flesh off of bones. It wasn't just something that was horrific to watch. Oftentimes, the people who would see it would denigrate the people who were poor, who were were resorting to these sort of activities, and then make associations about them their moral character and things like that. And one of the people had described it as a period of inhitat, it's like moral and social collapse that the famine had caused.
Is there a location in modern Lebanon where it's felt more, that it's such a painful experience compared to the rest? From what I've read, Beirut is not as tragic as other locations. Is that a fair assessment?
So it's interesting because there is a sense that the people who lived in Beirut, Nicholas Ajay wrote the first dissertation on this back in 1973, and he'd done years worth of research. He did personal interviews with people. And in one of his footnotes, he notes that when he asked people from Beirut, like, who suffered the worst, they said, well, we had so much suffering and death on our streets. And it was, they did. Every day, in Beirut, in the height of the famine, 3 carts would go through the city, and they'd just be picking bodies up off the streets. One person described it like, like loading a cart full of cabbages or like old clothes.
Yeah.
Just throw them on there, and they'd drive them out, and they would either dump them in the sea or they'd say in the sands. If you look at the old maps, this is probably just to the sort of kind of south of Sanaya. And they just kind of dug loose pits, dumped the bodies in there, covered them over. The jackals probably came and started picking the bodies off almost immediately. And then they would wait and they'd go do it again. So in Beirut, it was evident that this was happening. In Mount Lebanon, of course, many of the people died, and most of the people in Beirut who died, by the estimation of some of the people at the end of the war, had been Lebanese.
Right. Yeah.
And this is also something that kind of took place too. You have this othering of the people.
When you say had been Lebanese, you're referring to
Mount Lebanon.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So, for instance, you read, there's basically the Ottomans had sent out this group to kind of like to conduct a survey of the Wilayat of Beirut in 1915, 1916, and they had kind of gone through the different provinces and different towns. And when they're in Soud, they were talking to the governor there, or the mayor of the town, and he was talking about essentially sort of the flood of immigrants who had come in and were living in the streets, and at this point actually dying in droves of typhus. There were 300 infections that had taken place in the city, and 100 people had died. So
it's most visible in Beirut then, but it's a byproduct of starvation in the mountain.
Yeah.
So it's okay.
It would have been bad in Beirut, but the fact that you also have the sort of Beirut as this sort of kind of nexus point where people are drawn to it, and then the suffering intensifies because, of course, there aren't jobs, and you can't afford food, and there's not really a major social network set up. And a lot of these sort of charitable organizations over time, they cease to get donations coming in. And so while you have, like, say, the state providing some assistance, so Jamal Pasha, of course, is blamed for the famine. He did provide charitable organizations, even the Maronite Patriarchate, including the Red Cross, with funding and with support for them to conduct charity. The state didn't have its own charitable arm until 1917, really.
Other major cities, though, is Beirut impacted less than others?
It had more political clout. And in doing so, this gave it a little bit more sway. But the way that they attempted to solve the problem, so Azmi Bey was the governor of the city there, and he's also one of these roundly despised individuals. Very sort of like, is a solid Ottoman bureaucrat at this point, very centralizing. One of the first things he did when he came to power in 1915 was to deny the right of anyone else to distribute aid or to conduct relief work in the city. And it seems like a really awful thing to do. But 1915, people weren't really dying on the streets yet. They were kind of like providing people with jobs and kind of just like trying to prevent things from getting exceptionally bad. But really the goal was to allow the Ottoman state to become the main focus of what people were seeing, like for them to be like respected for their assistance to the population. And the fact that they failed on that was very obvious to people. People are dying in the streets, and Azmi is ripping up downtown Beirut to widen the roads and taking people's homes by eminent domain and paying them off in Ottoman lira and promissory notes that are worth literally nothing by the end of the war. So all these things kind of create different difficulties. Tripoli had far more poverty than Beirut. And far less political support. And less influence, so less political support. So you didn't get even the sort of basic stuff, because we had Ahmad Darouk here in Beirut, who was, for the most part, even from 1916, really pushing hard for like actual aid and support for people. He actually personally opened up a number of cleansing stations, some soup kitchens for people to help out. And you had other private charities, including actually the Syrian Protestant College, now the AUB, setting up institutions trying to help out. And some of these were like officially illegal. No, they weren't supposed to be distributing aid in the city at this point, but they kind of overlooked them just because obviously things were getting so bad that even they could run a soup kitchen out of Khayats across the street from the university and nobody was going to go shut that down.
Let's segue, if we can, from that kind of sort of dramatic, deadly scene where people are starving and dying to the rapid conclusion of a war that changes the region forever.
Yeah.
And builds a new identity for us. And it takes time for that to take hold. But there's this linkage between identity and suffering. And if we can go into that.
Yeah.
Is the famine quickly shaping that identity from day one? Or is it something that we look back on later? In other words, is the famine as present in building Lebanon in 1918, or is that something that takes time?
So the odd thing about this, and I live in Ireland right now, and Ireland, of course, is historically defined by British colonialism and the famine.
Yeah.
So you would imagine that for a nation that underwent a trauma that was probably about as profound. I mean, Ireland maybe about
was it a third?
And Neva's here. I don't want to get my numbers wrong. Good, she's not sitting there. Possibly about 25% of the population.
More? Oh, okay, yeah, a fourth of the
Yeah. And then you had
Lebanon was roughly the same, or
roughly. I mean, and it's hard because we don't really have good numbers.
Yeah.
We have, and the dangerous thing is we have numbers and they're very unreliable. We know that it was terrible.
Yeah.
And for me, this is, I think, the important thing. Like the numbers themselves are just like, they're intensifiers, so we understand the situation a little bit better when we describe it to people. For people on the ground experiencing it, 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 deaths, it doesn't change the horrors of their life that they're living at that exact moment.
Yeah.
So in the aftermath of the famine, you had a lot of anger, and a lot of it was towards the Ottoman state. Jamal Pasha was blamed. A lot of the sort of kind of like underlings that he had were, clearly vilified. But also it was, the elites. They were seen because many of them had made alliances with Jamal. And in part, it was just politics. He is the political leader, and as the leaders of their community, it was their responsibilities to be the intermediary between the government and their communities. If you can gain patronage from the state, you can then distribute it to your people and prevent them from suffering perhaps quite as much. But also, some of these people wound up being given essentially the keys to the relief funds that were out there. And many of these sort of merchant elites in the cities, of course, they can't do trade anymore. So what are they going to do? Well, they have this cash, and the cash has to be used somehow to generate income. So this went into speculation. This went into profiteering. This went into usurious loans that could be up to 3 times. You're taking, like, say, giving money out in paper lira that is worthless, and you're going to be paid back in gold at the end of the war. And so, as the Yamin quote had indicated, it wasn't just the Ottomans that they're blaming. It really was everyone who they had seen as being responsible for this. So the initial sort of thoughts after the war were actually very kind of class-oriented. Like it wasn't just like they did this to us. We did this to ourselves, or they at the top did this to the people at the bottom. And so over time, this begins a shift, and I think in part is the immediate need to justify the French intervention one, and then also the mandatory kind of legitimacy after this. And I'm just getting into this now with some of my research into the kind of aftermath, because...
Are the French considered saviors from famine? I never thought of that sort of link.
Well, it's an interesting thing, because the Entente blockade was a major sort of catalyst for the famine in the first place. And there was a refusal actually to lift the famine. This is actually brought up, a number of different times. Actually, Jamal Pasha had approached the Patriarch and had applied some pressure and had actually said, can you contact the Pope and have the Pope talk to the Entente and say, like you're killing Maronite Christians, you're Catholics within your church. Can you ask the other Christian powers not to do that? And they tried, and the British and the French didn't. In fact, somewhere in the British parliamentary records, there's actually someone brought this up in Parliament and said there are tens of thousands of people starving to death in Syria right now as a result of this blockade. And I believe the Prime Minister or the Merchant of the Navy had said, well, that means that that means the blockade is working. And there was no concern about the goal ultimately was to try to get a revolt within the population to overthrow the Ottomans, create chaos in the southern part, and then this would allow them to focus their energies on the Germans, who were their real focus in the war.
Right.
And of course, that didn't happen. People who were that starving and in that great a state of misery, they're not in any state to revolt. The Arab revolt, of course, comes from Hijaz.
Yeah.
And you have people, of course, kind of joining up from other parts of the region, but the desired revolt never took place. And in the end, you had kind of many people who got by because the French did give some assistance through spies. And immediately after the war, they aligned themselves with certain local leaders and distributed massive amounts of aid across the country to kind of show that they were a benevolent new power that was going to come in and take over at least part of the region they're in. They're in the western sort of area along the coast. And so today I was actually going through the AAB's archives again, and I found a mention by the public health head of the Lebanese mandate, who had said, the immediate aftermath of the war, the French came in, through their beneficence, they were able to stop the famine that had ravaged the countryside almost immediately.
That's coming from the French.
From the French. This was actually, he was Lebanese, but he was working as the head of that.
French.
Yeah. And my question actually with my new project is, well, did it? And because it doesn't seem like this is possible.
Yeah.
If you have a society-altering horror that goes for 3.5 years like the famine, even if you give money out, even if you give food out and release all the warehouses full of wheat, it's not just going to stop. And the thing that I was seeing in all the other research I was doing was that high prices remained. People were speculating on rents, assuming that, when the, say, French mandatory authorities came in and established Beirut as their major capital center, that you'd have lots of officers and people coming in and needing to pay, and they would pay good money. So people couldn't get housing actually between about 1920 and 1922. The Syrian lira fluctuated wildly. So, even though the jobs were there and the economy had shifted and people could kind of get back to normal a little bit, there was still intense poverty. And when you have starvation too, it somatically changes you. So people's bodies were suffering. You still had intense, under 5 mortality rates among children. You imagine the sort of kind of coronary sort of possibilities that could take place as a result of long-term malnutrition. Tuberculosis, which even actually killed Howard Bliss, the president of the AAB, in 1920. Something he contracted during the war, and it's kind of gradually got worse and worse and worse. Tuberculosis, according to what sources I've consulted, was a major problem that continued on, and of course, maintained itself for several years afterwards until actually the French were able to kind of put a tamp on it after a while.
So there was a soft attempt at legitimizing French mandatory rule by famine relief. Is that the story?
And relief is always political. You can't have relief without it. I mean, think of the Ottomans. So the Ottomans made relief political by failing at it.
Right.
Because they couldn't succeed in that. In the cases after 1917, they attempted to set up, government shelters, orphanages, and things like that. According to a number of sources, they were so badly run that you actually had people dying in droves in them. And they had to shut down the orphanages because they were essentially death traps.
But beyond the French mandate and looking at identity in itself, since the famine covers the entire modern Lebanon geography, the Mutasarrifi and Vilayet Beirut and all of that, I never thought of the famine as shaping Lebanese identity.
Yeah.
Is there something there?
And I don't think it did. And this is actually the interesting thing, because initially, because the famine was used literally at the Paris Peace Conference, Patriarch Hueg shows up, and part of the pitch to actually create a greater Lebanon was that we couldn't have a situation where Mount Lebanon can no longer feed itself.
Right. Yeah.
So, in 1914, Lebanon provided 1/11th of its own grain, or 1/11th, 1/20th, I think, actually.
Of the empire's
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, it would import it from like, say, Syria, from Turkey, from Egypt, wherever is cheap, it would come in. And so, the ultimate goal really was to create a self-sufficient state. And so needing this extra land was kind of a major aspect of that sort of kind of pitch.
And that links to the famine, that we can't let that happen again?
Yeah, we can't let that happen again. Therefore, we need, Junub, Ba'a, Akkar, all these areas that may not politically fit with the sort of patriarch's vision for a kind of Maronite-dominated Christian Lebanon, but that economically speaking would be an important sort of element of that.
Yeah.
So because it was politicized, essentially, many people wound up kind of rejecting it. Some people who felt an affiliation with the Turks still, in particular, the Ottomans. Shakib Arslan initially come out and actually kind of denied that the famine really was a thing. And then a couple years later, when he was kind of rehabilitating himself, he said actually 200,000 people died in the famine, which in Mount Lebanon would have been the present population. I mean, the census dictated population would have been about half the population.
Which he over-exaggerated for...
Yeah, to kind of like flip it.
Yeah. So that's interesting. The famine does play a role in politics.
It does, yeah.
At least in terms of the mandate's conclusion, which is legitimizing Greater Lebanon.
Yeah. And so this actually then, created a major problem because it was a shared experience. In fact, the first Martyrs Square statue was two mothers, the Muslim mother, Christian mother, holding their dead children out, to kind of show the shared sacrifice that had been made.
Yeah.
And the current statue that we have right now was something that came about actually later on. An Italian guy actually had done it instead of the...
Mazzurati or something like that. Yeah.
And
I didn't know the weeping woman had to do with famine, though. I thought that was a sort of a slight attempt at Phoenician urn with both communities burying the dead together. I never thought of starvation as part of it.
Yeah, that was the... And apparently, because the famine was such a sort of era of like, horror and shame even. Like, it wasn't like the sort of like... It wasn't the origin story a nation wants. Like, you don't want to be like... You want to be out there, you want to conquer your way through and become like... Seize your destiny. You want to do like, Safar Bar, like Feiruz movie, sort of like, expelling the Turks from your village, sort of like, conquest. Like, this gives you like, something to be proud of. And famine is not something to be proud of.
It's interesting, yeah.
You had people in the Mahtar who would talk about the famine as this like, this era that should be forgotten. And apparently people actually were like defacing the statue and they actually had to take it down and remove it from circulation even prior to...
I'll push back on this. I don't think the famine is why that deranged man was axing at the statue.
Okay.
It was, if I remember it right, it's Yusuf Hwayek's statue. I forgot the name of the guy with the axe who comes and says, this is not meant to celebrate triumph. This is defeat.
Yeah.
And it's woman versus men. I don't think most people know the woman carrying the torch is a woman today in Martyrs Square, but that's sort of a side story.
Yeah.
But I thought that was the justified, that was the explanation.
Yeah.
More of weakness as opposed to strength.
Yeah, yeah.
But the famine tie-in is really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, this is kind of like, I suppose it's an interpretation of that, kind of adding that onto it because of the famine connection.
Right.
But yeah, it was never really something that became a motivating sort of like aspect within the Lebanese historical narrative, And in part, it could be because many of the people who, of course, are politically prominent during the mandate were politically prominent during the famine. And it was not really a history that people wanted to bring with them.
So bringing it, in a way, fast forwarding how we relate our identity to famine from within and looking at it from outside, let's say. When does it actually become part of that identity? Is it something that's looked at post-independence? Yeah,
and it's interesting. It's present in, like, say, the school curriculum.
Yeah.
Like, but in a very nominal sense. And I think it's, if you read, like, many sources on the era, like memoirs and stuff, like, you'll see the famine mentioned, but it's like...
Footnote, yeah.
Yeah, it's like, it's maybe a couple of paragraphs, maybe a page or two. You get the highlights. You get Jamal Pasha, you get the locusts. You get, starvation and maybe some... You get either typhus or plague. Usually it's plague, because plague is way more interesting than typhus, and so people know plague. And that's it. It's just kind of horrible things happen. Half the population died. And then politically, the creation of Lebanon happens. And either, depending who's writing the memoir, it's a good thing or a bad thing.
Right, yeah.
But it really wasn't until really the 100-year anniversary of the war that people really kind of came back to this, and people started kind of focusing on things, academically. Lena back there has done some amazing work on that. But up until that point, it was just kind of something that was kind of nudged to the side. You had a couple of scholarly dissertations. People might write a couple of things that would kind of pop up in the sources, but it really wasn't like a major focus. Like the number for something so transformational, you'd imagine that the bibliography has to be gigantic, and it's really not. Stunningly so. And so in the last few years, there's been a couple of scholarly monographs. There's been a few less scholarly sources came out, kind of popular histories to kind of get out some of the narratives. Yeah. So interest has come up. Of course, Yazan Halwani's memory tree downtown came out its way again of kind of bringing that to the fore and kind of reminding people about it. And it's a beautiful sort of tribute. I found it fascinating, actually, when I was checking out his Facebook page about this, because actually a lot of people felt, not a lot, but a number of people kind of posted that they were kind of angry about it. Like, why is this in Beirut? Like, this was a Lebanese, and by Lebanese, of course, they mean this is a mountain trauma. And by locating it in Beirut, this seems to dilute it. Although Yazan's explanation was that it was a common suffering that everyone had gone through, and that, to put it in Beirut, which was, of course, was and is the center right now of Lebanon, does show that shared focus rather than kind of keeping away. Like the majority of people who died in the famine, of course, did come from Mount Lebanon. Yeah. But, the suffering is something that was kind of more diffuse in its own sort of way.
So the politics reemerges for more ownership reasons. This is our suffering, not yours.
Yeah. And if it's a real trauma. I mean, like, this is considered a genocide. So to have that, I guess, kind of like redirected, or the narrative of this experience changed, of course, is going to be a major sort of like challenge to one's understanding of oneself, even, and like one's connection to history. Yeah. And in many cases, especially because people's challenging of that narrative were being done to kind of reject that suffering, to diminish it. Yeah. Or to defend the Ottomans, who many people had seen as being complicit in it. It's an insulting sort of thing. So I can see the sort of the pain and the sort of response that comes out of that.
Just one more point before we go to break and then Q&A.
Yeah.
It's a section I didn't reach in the book. It's about humanitarian aid and how maybe social attitudes kick in towards that. Yeah. Let's go there just a bit.
Yeah.
How people relate to humanitarian aid in this country, or maybe how it contributes to negative sort of aspects of that relationship.
Yeah. In the case of my particular focus here actually was on one aspect of the humanitarian aid. And Melanie Tanyelian, one of my excellent colleagues, has done some really fantastic work on humanitarian and charitable organizations, working with Greek Orthodox, Greek Catholic sources, kind of the external sources as well. In my case, I was looking at actually the Protestants.
Because you're at AUB?
Because it may be, and it was sources that people really hadn't touched on that much yet. Yeah. But the Protestants had done a lot of relief work during the famine. You essentially had two different sort of sides of this. You had the AUB and the Red Cross, which was affiliated with the American consul, and they were politically a little bit more protected. They had a good relationship with Jamal Pasha, and Jamal actually gave them permission to do work in the mountain. In fact, Arthur Dray, who was the dentist at the AUB, or was SPC at the time, allegedly, and this has been repeated by a number of people, so it's probably true, was called to Palestine in the middle of like the night urgently. And apparently someone had attempted to assassinate Jamal, but had missed and had hit a Turkish dignitary, creating havoc in his mouth. So Dray is brought in, and Jamal Pasha basically said, "Here, fix him, please. And if you tell anyone about this, I'm going to have you killed." Which was probably true. Jamal was that kind of guy. And Dray apparently did a great job. And Dray was also a very sort of interesting character in general. And so he fixes the guy up, and Jamal's like, "Well, what do you want?" And so Dray had begun working on kind of like augmenting a soup kitchen that had been established in Buramana. The Kurtas family had started it, and so Dray was up there estivating as a wealthy, during the war, as one does. and he sees these people kind of stumbling around, starving, and so he goes and he sees that this relief work is starting, and he gets Jamal to fund a significant amount of this. In the end, it turns out being something like $270,000 worth of aid is spent in Brahmana on about between the number I think is over. It's like 2,700, 3,000, maybe 5,000 people are helped by this in the end. Men couldn't get it, but for women and children particularly, this was a lifeline. And so the American community actually really kind of stepped up around this time and saw this as kind of an expression of what they needed to give to the country. In fact, that they may have life and have it abundantly was something that was created, in 1923 during the Bayard Dodge presidency. So Dodge was a 26-year-old professor at the time when the war starts. And in addition to running like the YMCA and keeping people happy on campus, he, ran a number of soup kitchens throughout the mountain and was the major go-between between the Red Cross and Nearest Relief and, the local kitchens here. In part because his father was Cleveland Dodge, who was the vice president of Phelps Dodge, the, mining conglomerate. So he had a lot of Presbyterian wealth on hand to kind of fuddle into this. So on the other side of things, you have the mission schools and the mission community, the mission press. And so they were like more overtly anti-Ottoman with this. And they figured out midway through the war that through a very...
Overtly Ottoman in what sense? Overtly identity-wise, or...
I mean, they denigrated, they hated Jamal Pasha openly, whereas the AUB, because they needed to maintain the institution, they couldn't... If they had come out openly against Jamal Pasha and the Ottomans... the AUB would have been shut down, just like San Joseph.
So it's really anti-Jamal Pasha.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of like not so veiled racism in a number of the articles. But they did not like the Ottoman authorities.
Yeah.
And constantly kind of worked to undermine them. But somebody in New York figured out it was a Syrian had approached the American mission and had asked, "Can we send remittances back because we can't send it through banks?" And so they figured out that the Standard Oil Company had offices located in Istanbul and in parts of the empire. So they would exchange their money in New York for Turkish lira, and they would transfer it on the books to the Standard Oil Company's various subsidiaries. And the Standard Oil Company would then wire money to Beirut, either the post office, tobacco regie, any number of government buildings, and Charles Dana, the head of the American Mission Press, would go down there, collect it, come back. They would send telegrams that had the names of the people who was to be distributed to and their rough locations, transliterated by American women, like, say, secretaries and, individuals who didn't really have any sort of sense of what Aaliya was supposed to look like when you transliterate it. So finding people sometimes became very difficult, but they managed to get out several $100,000, if not more, worth of aid to people. I think one of the estimates was around 2 million over the course of the war. And so, this was another sort of mechanism for transmitting aid. And in the end, you also had a number of soup kitchens that got set up. And the problem kind of comes in when you're deciding who gets to eat and who doesn't. Because especially with sort of kind of Presbyterian ethos around this time, it wasn't just like you can't just give out food just because there's food to be given and people need it, because a lot of people need it. You're talking maybe about a few thousand, maybe 14,000 people, perhaps, probably less, who maybe actually ever got any assistance from the American missionaries. And you have hundreds of thousands of people who are in desperate need. So how do you decide who gets to get it? They had a number of different criteria, and a lot of it kind of boils down to moral purity. And the question of inhitat, is this a sort of collapse of society? The moral aspect of this was very important for people who were very sort of kind of living on the edge of the famine and looking down at it. So people could be denied aid if they were unwilling to work. People could be denied aid if they had what's called an evil disease. So if you had syphilis. So people could be denied aid if they were confirmed beggars. And there's a whole series of things if you're a burden upon someone else. And in the end, it comes down to people who might be possibly able to survive, but also then to contribute to society afterwards. Initially, I was very skeptical about this, but a number of people, including Albert Byerly, I believe, who was a missionary, but also ran a lot of these operations, he had made the comment, we don't want to find ourselves in a position where the worthiest of people had died, leaving only the unworthy in the aftermath of this. And it has this very chilling, almost sort of like social engineering aspect to it. And it's also very judgmental, because if you're denying people aid who had engaged in, like, say, begging, prostitution, and things like that, you're really denying people who needed it most, who ran out of money first, and who were trying to keep themselves and their families alive. By moralizing this, now you've suddenly condemned them to death. And also, I mean, their honor is already, in many cases, probably challenged in the community, although judgments seem to have been more harsh from the top than from within at the time. But it's a very sort of like frustrating thing for me to read and to see, like, how worthiness was applied to a situation where it shouldn't be. You know, it should be need, it should be benevolence and empathy, and it wasn't there.
This sort of juggling of morality and humanity and the sort of maybe the wider purpose of the book. I'm going to pull from the preface a line in there. I'm going to quote you to you, which I love doing. Just as the crisis of the present brought clarity to my understanding of the past, I hope this analysis of the past might bring similar insight to understanding of our present and future calamities, and above all into our understanding of humanity in times of crisis. So really the purpose of the book, you mentioned it was meant to be an environmental focused book.
Yeah.
It ends up being a history in a way, almost a document of human suffering.
Yeah.
So your own reasons for pushing through this type of writing, is it simply that you're here witnessing a country repeat itself? Are you seeing Syrians on the street and you feel like this is familiar to your research? Or is there a bigger cause here? Because I spoke to Charles Hayek, who's a friend of yours, friend of mine. He's a history buff, as you know.
Yes.
He loves this book. And he said so. I think it's okay to share that in public.
I appreciate Charles. He's a wonderful guy.
He's one of my favorite guests on the podcast. And he emphasizes that this is maybe one of the few human-oriented stories of World War I and the famine itself.
Yeah.
So what took you down that road?
And it really was, in essence, I think part of it was the sources. You know, the things that I was seeing, the humanity that was, it wasn't so much interesting. I felt it was something that had to be out. Like, you can't describe a famine without people. And I found that the environmental aspect of the famine was just numbers. It was like harvest dates, and it was like, wheat versus barley and things like that. And that's not what I was reading was the important thing. Sure, that was an element of the problem and how the problem develops, but reading someone say was this real? Like this woman who came to my door with the half-dead skeleton of her baby saying, God has abandoned me. No, you don't abandon me too. And he said, and I couldn't. I failed and she died. Like,
so these sorts of things archival inquiry that takes you down this road.
Yeah. And it was something that was just like, it moved me to the point where it needed to be dealt with. And for me, I also couldn't necessarily have the famine turn into something where it was like, many of the histories of the famine are about, readdressing questions about why. Why did it happen? Who caused it? Who is responsible? Who suffered the most? It's like a competition, in essence. And when I saw that, though, it wasn't necessarily like, again, that wasn't the important part. People suffered in their own way, and people in different parts of the community suffered differently. People in different parts of the region suffered. Like your place was important. Your economic status was important. Your identity. Are you a man? Are you a woman? Like, are you a child? How do all of these aspects of your identity affect your lived experience of something like this that is so much bigger than everything around you? And so it was something I felt needed to be out there and kind of like to give a human element to the famine that, that I felt needed to be there. And a lot of the things that have been done on it recently, I think, have that. I think that's one thing I think I love about being where I am, I guess, in terms of my research is that it is a community, I think, that has the right focus now, and their hearts are in the right place, and they want to get out the stories, and they want to make it human. And so
I like that you're in Ireland teaching this kind of story to a country that I think has made some progress in reconciling that chapter of their history to some degree.
Yeah.
I don't think the famine is thought of as a problematic, identity-ridden issue for most of Ireland's, let's say, history buffs.
Yeah.
I think this is the kind of document that can help Lebanese reconcile that chapter of their history, and it's masterfully written. So I encourage anyone to order it from either Aaliya's or Antoine, or if they're lucky at AUB.
Well, we're here, so Aaliya's, certainly.
Aaliya's, yeah. What is Antoine? Aaliya's, yeah. And there's a lot of stuff. I mean, it's a very dense story too, so we can open up other subjects during the Q&A.
Certainly.
Let's take a 5-minute break. Tylor Brand, thank you. Thank you. Okay, so guys, let's make the Q&A fun. Take advantage of Tylor's slipping sobriety. You can have another gin and tonic after if you like.
There's some ice in there. I think it's
the spice, really?
No, ice, not spice.
Ice.
Yeah.
Let's make it spicy.
Nice gin and tonic, though.
No, let's make it fun and hopefully light enough given the subject matter.
Yeah.
But anything you'd like to ask Tylor about famine, about his personal life?
It's pretty boring.
But his karaoke?
Yes.
Turn the microphone on.
Great voice, William. Great voice. It's not working?
There we go.
Now it's working. Thank you so much, Tylor. That was fantastic.
Thank you for having me.
Well, you're more than welcome. I have a couple of questions. Am I allowed a couple of questions, Ronnie, or just one?
You can have. You're the owner of Aaliya's. You can have all the questions.
So if we know that famines are almost always a political decision, why don't we attach the same sort of judgment towards the type of systemic killing that is enacted by famines? And why does it not get the same sort of historical attention?
I think it depends on if you're on the receiving end or the giving end of this. So, for instance, when I was in the Emirates teaching, I had probably about 40% of my students were from India or Pakistan. And
I was thinking about the Indian
yeah.
proliferation, 20 million people killed under British occupation.
Yeah, and especially, I mean, the Bengal famine. Like, I would have students...
Which one?
Yes, exactly. No, the one during World War II, which was deliberately orchestrated by Churchill as a way to prevent the Japanese from having access to food supplies if they had invaded. And granted, there was probably a good chance of it happening, but it didn't. But then preventing the sort of, replenishing of supplies in other areas that were actually directly suffering. My students were incensed by it. And they had stories going back through the generations, much like actually with the Lebanese famine, about all the horrors that they experienced and even the sort of, in certain cases, persecution they received. One of my students was from the fisherman's caste, and she was untouchable, or her family was untouchable, which meant that she was not permitted to be in any of the relief works run by Brahmins, because their presence there meant that they could contaminate the water, the food, and render it impure. So she had to go, and her family would pretend to convert to Christianity so they could be in the Protestant ones. And the response to that was very, very direct. They knew exactly who was responsible for it, and were very clear about it. And really, within the Lebanese famine, it was very much the same. The people who were accused of that, rightly or wrongly in certain cases, are renowned in some of the books. The Yamin quote that we started this off with, actually, it wasn't just a general thing that we must blacken the pages of the names of the individuals who did this to us. The book is full of those exact names. Like, he was making a list so that we can, make sure that everyone knows what they've done. So there's politics there. And in certain cases in the famine, it was not necessarily, I think, a political decision, quite like you would see in the Indian famine. Political decisions were made that made it worse. But the famine itself was actually even a disaster for the Ottoman administration. If you want to keep the province from revolting, you don't want it to be starving and hating you. So a lot of incompetence was involved there, and just kind of like, if you don't know how to deal with a crisis like this, and it would have been difficult to stop anyways, it's really easy to make it worse.
But I guess those economic decisions are political as well, aren't they?
Yeah, very much so. But at that time, too, you didn't really have a lot of options economically. The port of Beirut supplied the majority of the wealth into the city. Mount Lebanon depended heavily on the silk trade. So the Entente decision, actually, from the outside, and their political decision to blockade, in that particular case, actually would be another one of these angles. Because you also often have this sort of kind of like two sides of the blame game, too. And in the book, I try as much as possible to stay away from the blame aspect, because there's a lot to go around, and a lot of it is completely warranted for everyone. But the blockade itself really was one of these major catalyzing factors that prevented the situation from resolving itself. And famine was common across World War I. Everywhere from Germany to Russia, all the way up to Persia. The Iranian state suffered terrible famines. Tens of thousands, perhaps 100,000 people died. Greece was in a famine. A lot of things were going on because of the war. It wasn't just Lebanon, but in terms of the concentration of suffering.
But Lebanon lost the most people as a percentage of any place in World War One.
Yeah, I mean, even if you go with the lower estimates of the population loss, the Lebanese famine was one of the worst crises in the 20th century, which was a century of horrific crises.
And then, so why has that not entered into kind of, I guess, wider, particularly Western discourse?
I mean, Eurocentrism, racism, Orientalism, a lot of these things. But I think also it's just, because it wasn't something that really kind of like was made into a big deal in a sort of grand sense here.
But that's the question. Why not?
Yeah. Politics, in essence. And also, I mean, I think the sort of proprietary sort of like sense that, especially for the people of Mount Lebanon, the Maronites in particular, this was their disaster. And so the politics within the country kind of like preventing it from becoming a sort of kind of unified idea of a shared famine up until probably very recently. I think it kind of maybe tamped down its utility. On top of the fact that, in the 1930s, many of the people who helped rule the country as part of the mandate, were associated with Jamal Pasha and the Ottomans as well. And so in doing so, this brings some very uncomfortable sort of realities to the fore. You don't want these sort of bits of information getting out if politically this is a very important thing for you to kind of maintain your image with. So that may have been one thing as well. But I think also just this famine studies tend to focus on certain cases. You have, India, Ethiopia, Russia, Ireland, and most of the famine books you see out there are going to be that. I became somewhat acquainted with one of the great famine scholars, Cormac O'Grada, when I was actually at a conference in Sweden, of all places. But then talking to him in Ireland, he never knew that there was a famine in Lebanon up until the point where I was at a conference with him and he heard me give a presentation on it.
Wow.
And it has not gotten out into sort of kind of general understanding. And it's not like Lebanon hasn't had other horrific sort of traumas throughout its history. And the Civil War kind of overrides a lot of things as well. And 100 years is 100 years. And we have the carnage of World War I. I think that also tends to kind of overshadow things. As bad as it was in Lebanon, essentially 3 days on the battlefield in Verdun actually produced more casualties and more deaths. And so for the Europeans who feel World War I was their calamity, I think that probably, looking at the suffering of another country by famine, and people don't think of famine as being as, I guess, immediate as war. I think it just kind of got overlooked to some extent.
And I guess with the 14 million Indians who died,
Yeah. But even the Indians, of course, got overlooked quite a bit too.
That's what I mean, yeah. And then I guess my second question, well, I guess it will be, if there were kind of economic issues for including areas outside of what might have been the traditional kind of Christian part of Lebanon when they created the state, would it not have been more politically expedient to have created a greater Syria under a kind of pluralistic democratic government?
There was a sense of obligation to the kind of patriarchate, and the idea that they need to create a sort of haven for the Christians in Lebanon. The sort of kind of French politics, I think, kind of angled in that particular direction, and also kind of created like two different sort of areas. Not to say it's a sort of divide and conquer sort of situation, but the French knew how to rule Lebanon. They felt better than they knew how to rule kind of the conglomeration of the two different societies together. It's a little bit outside the scope of the book, though. So,
fantastic. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's good.
Hi. So 2 questions. I didn't attend the talk, but I have a question. So let's say you're a consultant for the Ministry of Education at Lebanon, and you get the chance to give an objective narrative on the famine, and with it the birth of Great Lebanon and the marriage of Beirut and Mount Lebanon, and the whole thing. So how would you shape it in different? You've taken a look at the academic books we have in schools, and so how would you shape that differently according to your experience with researching about this whole thing? That's one. And two, I don't know where I heard this, but it was one of the things for the birth of Great Lebanon, because of the people of Mount Lebanon were basically suffered and were killed because of this famine, that one of the ways to expand the territories of Mount Lebanon was that the people of Mount Lebanon would never suffer such a famine with zero agriculture, like with barely any agricultural lands, as the Beqa Valley, for example. So one of the goals was to expand to Beqa Valley and to other agricultural lands in the north, even though people from Tripoli weren't convinced with this whole Great Lebanon thing for a while. So I don't know if, I want you to just maybe confirm on, was it one of the reasons? Maybe, I don't know where, because I don't know where I saw this. So
I mean, it was in the speech that was given actually at the Paris Peace Conference. To make an economically viable Lebanon, you needed to have a port. And if you just had, say, Jounieh, it wouldn't have been sufficiently large to be able to kind of generate the income needed to support. I mean, Beirut had a huge population, had lots of wealth, and so it was kind of the important city on the coast, and had a very long, of course, connection with Lebanon. The silk industry was funneled into Beirut by the mid 19th century, and so it was kind of a logical sort of connection there. Everything else, of course, was connected in part for political purposes, and there's a lot of kind of other little kind of historical aspects that we probably don't want to get into just right now. But the idea that you needed this sort of kind of hinterland to the mountain, to the coast. The coast would produce the economic wealth through trade. The mountain could produce, silk. Plus it was, for, Maronite political leaders, of course, kind of a heartland of, the Maronite Christian population. The historical Mount Lebanon, of course, you have the Druzes involved in this as well. So then incorporating the other elements then just in to produce, wheat fields that you wouldn't have to then worry about being blockaded was seen as being a sort of logical progression with that. In terms of, I think, about rewriting the curriculum, I think the important thing really is to try to depoliticize it. I think the difficult part when narrating the famine is that you have a sense that you have to give a cause to it. And with a cause, you also get the idea that it has to be someone to blame with it. And in certain cases, of course, blame is important. It's like you need to know who is violated, especially if someone has done something to you and your community. But I do think the human element needs to be the central focus. I think that a basic sort of narrative about the sort of circumstances that produced it, because it wasn't linear. It wasn't just this happened, then this happened, then this happened, and then all these piled on top of each other, and this produced the famine. There's interlinking and overlapping, and time changed things. And people's circumstances change things. And you had mentioned, this is a social thing that had many different layers to it. And so to get at that, you kind of have to get to the stories. And I almost feel as though, like, the thing that I would really love to see happen, and I'm just talking to Charles about this as a potential thing, is to have kind of an oral familial history come together, because the opportunity to get the stories from the people who lived it is gone. Like, that generation is dead. Their children are now, in many cases, beginning to pass as well. But we still have the stories that people told. You know, the things that, you know, at holidays, people sitting around and talking about, your great uncle did this, and like, because of this, we survived the famine. Now, these are the sorts of stories I think that are really important. And the
Oral
ones that,
history.
Yeah, oral history.
You see it mostly maybe in culinary heritage.
Yeah, that too. I mean,
how it got shaped differently.
Yeah, I think that these sorts of things are the things that can make the famine a sort of kind of constructive thing. Because historically speaking, it's been destructive, and I think that's one of the reasons why it hasn't had the sort of kind of sense of connection for many people. So I think that, you know, making it everyone's is important, even if, like, you know, suffering was different and more intense in certain areas. I think that, you know, even kind of having the empathy that generates is an important thing as well. I mean, I read some of the stories, and I have classes I've given, and actually in Rima's class, I think at least one person cried during one of those stories. Like, they're moving, like they like rend you when you really read them. And I think that it could be something that, you know, should be shared, really. Yeah,
I think maybe the Lebanese Association of History are trying to do something about that, and Forums ZFD launched the oral history website, but it's more about the Lebanese Civil War.
Yeah,
but
I know some people who have worked on that too, and it's a good I think project that needs to happen. So
yeah, and it needs to be interconnected with our academic system, because not few years ago there was like I don't know who remembers this, but there were a lot of people on the streets, and the topic of the famine was brought up again, and the blame game started happening all over again, and you had the Muslim Sunnites supporting the Turkish, you know, Ep.391 Ottomans Turkish, and and you had the Maronites also, like they did the land lock and they killed the people, and then you had the Muslim Sunnite, but the Allies were on our shores blocking our port, so there was this whole like blame game all over again. And if we can't figure that out yet, I don't know if we can figure the recent history of the Civil War itself.
Yeah, and it's, you know, I think empathy is important. You know, like, we have to understand experiences as humans, not necessarily, I guess, as, you know, my experience versus your experience as a sort of challenge.
Exactly.
But it's hard. I mean, it's something that's, you know, you can't tell someone, don't feel this.
Exactly. You need a
part of their history, so
certain level of maturity, politically speaking, at least. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Samira.
I'll just interject really quickly, though. In terms of Ireland, how is it taught exactly? Is it something that's just standard education, basic history, or is there an emphasis on nation building and identity?
I mean, you might be able to speak to this a little bit more directly. My son is right now 12 years old, and he's getting Irish history. And
your son is 12?
Yeah.
You have really? How old are you?
How old do I look?
Oh, I thought you were younger than me.
I'm 41 as of yesterday.
You are younger than me.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, happy birthday.
See, it's less depressing than 40. Because 40 is like a real date. 41 is just like, oh, yet another one. No, he was born here.
Really?
He was really angry that I came here without him.
Why didn't you bring him? He has school,
He has school, and he has basketball games. I coach his basketball teams. And
look at you.
In ATM, so...
I need to have a kid. Sorry, go back to...
they're really fun. So for him, like...
So you had a child before you started your Ph.D.?
While
you were doing your Ph.D.?
Yeah.
That's as interesting as the book you produced.
There are pictures, actually, of him... I used to do my work on an exercise ball because it was better on my back, I guess. And there's a picture of him standing on the back of the exercise ball, bouncing up and down while I'm trying to type my dissertation. And
wow.
Yeah.
That goes to show you can do both at the same time.
You can do both at the same time, you know? And because then when you get out and you have to start, like, working in academia, which is, like, soul-sucking and awful in many cases, then at least you have gotten like the sort of the difficult parts out of the way. And so he was like 4 by the time I was really doing stuff in academia.
Back to the famine.
Back to the famine, yeah. So from what he's getting, like they give him narratives and there's stories that come with it. So they do use like kind of like the horrors of the famine, but oftentimes it's still got a lot of kind of like pointedness. And in part it's because I think that there's a sort of like unwillingness to acknowledge, I guess, exactly how complicit the British were in this. For instance, I went to Queen's College has a up in Belfast has this like big beautiful natural history and historical museum, and they had a section on the famine that is as big as the space between you and me.
Meaning it's a very limited. Wait, I didn't get the reference.
Literally 2 little placards, and they had said that the weather was exceptionally bad in Ireland.
So that's Northern Ireland's way of looking at Irish history, right?
Yeah.
I went to Queen's College actually once. I took a course there.
It's a pretty campus.
It's a beautiful campus, but it's a strange place to study this part of the world.
Yeah.
It feels like it's a conflicted institute on how to address this part of the world. So I guess it comes from there.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So they don't like to get into the...
Well, at least I think from that particular side. But in the Republic where we live, it's different.
Yeah.
And the famine definitely has a political element. The family definitely has a sort of, a narrative that is emphasized. Because it was something that's, it struck Ireland with a ferocity that very few different countries have had. I mean, it shaped it. You had not only mass death, you had mass migration that took place after that. There's Liverpool is probably one of the biggest Irish cities technically because you had so many Irish that moved over there. Boston, for instance.
But sorry to take away just another question about Ireland and Lebanon. It seems like it's spread across this country, the way it's been written. Why is there a challenge there in addressing it here the way the Irish Republic addresses it, in your mind?
Yeah, I think it's because the Irish Republic had a bad guy that everyone was willing to kind of focus on.
Yeah.
And I think that the politics around, like blame and even, I guess, causality when it came to the Lebanese famine. The Lebanese famine was way more complicated when it came down to it.
So it's not just, you can't just look at Jamal Pasha and say that's the reason.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you could, but it wouldn't be
limited.
It wouldn't be capturing really even a fraction of things.
Right.
And we can look at Jamal Pasha and say that he was like, are we allowed to curse on this? I won't curse.
Sorry?
Are we allowed?
No, you can curse, sure.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, no, he's a bastard. I mean, historically speaking.
That's the curse, bastard. Give me something better.
I'm not in class, so I can't.
No, you're not exactly.
I can't let myself completely. But
Make your son proud of you. Say something vulgar.
Yeah. He won't watch this, don't worry. But no, he was of course the great villain. Everyone for the most part despised him. Even like the Sunni community of Beirut, who were allegedly his kind of allies, like Anbara Salam al-Khalili, Tariq's mother, in her memoir, writes like people would wander the streets saying like it'd be better if apes were ruling us than these Turkish and like she like very much focused on Jamal. And of course he executed her fiance too, so she had a really personal vendetta kind of against him. But she had, I think,
butcher is actually one of the compliments he gets. I mean, that's a
noble profession.
Exactly. Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's in Lebanon you have so many different elements that make it a complicated thing in terms of identity, in terms of causality, in terms of blame, that it's not cut and dry.
Even though it should be. I mean, it's not a limited sectarian geographic story. Everyone.
But I mean, it's also something that until very recently that wasn't really even like a question because it was assumed that it was.
Yeah.
So, and even amongst like historians of the famine, there's still a little bit of bickering going on about causality. Who really caused it? How did it get caused? And so, I actually tried to kind of push back a little bit on that. It was a process. It wasn't a cause. And the fact that it was a process, I think, makes sense more. Because it wasn't just one thing that everyone experienced. It was a lot of things. In Famine Worlds, every single person had their own particular window on that famine.
Yeah, right.
They either lived within it or they looked at it.
Yeah. Sorry to take away from the...
No, it's just fine. All right. So my question also has to do with causality. In recent years, Lebanon has been in a state of crisis, and it is in large part caused by the ruling class in this country. Now, we've addressed the Ottoman role in the famine. We've addressed the French role in the famine. But how do you feel the community itself contributed to the deepening and the cause of the actual famine? And do you feel that there's a parallel between what's happened back then and what is occurring again?
I mean, I think it's like I find it difficult to kind of like draw parallels between such disparate events, but I think that there are a lot of themes that we see. I mean, you have, of course, the people at the very top who use their position to benefit themselves. Gaining access to the rights to import grain, for instance, that was a really major one. In certain cases, the people off in the countryside who had the distribution rights were major landlords. When the price of grain goes up, of course, the people in control of the grain supply make extra money. So, the rural landlords became incredibly wealthy in a lot of areas. In the Orontes Valley area, by the end of the war,
thanks.
I did not even bring this up. They literally had entire warehouses that were overflowing with rotten grain at the end because they were hanging on to it because, they felt as though if they'd released it a little bit early, they may not profit completely. Warehouses throughout the city of Beirut, as soon as the French had come in and started bringing supplies in, immediately people started dumping it on the market, and the price of wheat temporarily dropped. So of course, you had inflation that continued on with that. So at the very top, you had the politically connected people creating major problems and making things worse. But it trickles down, though. You had the merchants and the people who have to kind of keep themselves alive, the shopkeepers and things like that. And the Ottomans, in order to prevent runaway inflation, said, okay, well, we're going to fix prices. What happens if you fix the price of a commodity? Black market. And that's exactly what happened. So if you buy grain at a reduced rate, and say like 10 piastres per, roughly like a 5 kilo sort of supply, and the Ottomans say you have to sell it for 8, you're not going to do it. Edward Nickley has a story about people go into the shops and they'd see the grain on the shelf and have the official price there and say, I'd like to buy that. And they said, I'm sorry, that's not for sale. He's like, oh, well, how do I buy grain? So you go around the back of the shop and then you'd buy it at market rates, which would be significantly higher. So the shopkeepers, of course, couldn't go broke doing this. But of course, they also, in certain cases, made a lot of money. And many people would kind of focus on them as a target of opprobrium because they were seen as being complicit in the starvation of the population. And the Ottomans occasionally try to stop this by kind of deporting a significant number of them into the interior of the country to try to kind of get everyone else in line. But if you had cash on hand, one of the only ways for you to make a living at this point, if the import-export trade was not there, was to speculate. And so this then became everyone else's problem. Even if famine is not necessarily a political thing in all the cases, although political situations did make it worse, it's an economic situation, and it produces situations that reinforce themselves. When scarcity happens, people need to make money, and so inflation begins to kick in because of speculation, because of hoarding. Think about during COVID, was the first thing that disappeared from the shelves in the stores.
Exactly, like masks.
Yeah, macaroni and toilet paper. The sort of things that people think they're going to need. And so suddenly with those gone, you have artificial scarcity created in the market. And so, speculation, hoarding. Fortunately, I don't think too many people were trying to hawk toilet paper. I know there's a few people got caught with $100,000 worth of hand sanitizer that they couldn't sell because of they were they were prevented from that. But I mean, it seems to be a fundamental element of our kind of market-driven capitalist societies that we want to take advantage of something when it's given to us. And I think stuff like that, it percolates throughout society. It's not just the top. It impacts everyone else in their sort of social and economic relations. And that's what makes it so hard to stop, because you can punish an individual at the top, but you can't, punish everybody if we're all kind of complicit. I think that at a certain point there was, but I think that in the case of the Ottomans, like say attempts to control the price, for instance, that was a political decision because it was seen as a way to stop the spiraling inflation. The Ottomans tried to take, for instance, coins out of circulation because Ottoman currency began to collapse because people ceased to kind of have faith in the Ottomans' war effort. And so, like, normally when you have currency fluctuations, your currency is, it's being compared to another currency, but there wasn't any other currency in the country. People were hoarding coin, and they would charge different rates based upon coin. So if you're spending, like, say, copper, silver, or gold, you're getting a much better rate on wheat, for instance, than if you come in with paper. And so, like, political decisions were often made to kind of counteract those things. It wasn't like a targeted, like, attempt for the most part, but it was like a complete mismanagement of the situation to the extent that it then became politically unmanageable. And then every time they tried,
capitalism is a political system. Deregulation is a political issue. Neoliberalism is a political issue. These are all political issues. And the idea of having an economic system which is somehow removed from politics seems a reductive way of looking at economics.
Oh no, it's not removed. It's not removed from politics. But in the case of World War I, when you have something like, say, locusts devouring 40% of the crop in Syria, plus an Entente blockade, plus like smuggling and hoarding and things like that. Every political decision has a consequence. And oftentimes the consequences are not what was intended. And in many cases, completely the opposite. In fact, the one thing that kind of strikes me is what happens from a lot of the Ottoman policies is they just like completely misread what they should have been doing. And to be fair, I mean, like, I've heard that the American missionaries being described as kind of rank amateurs who fucked up everything and like made everything worse because of how they didn't know how to do what they're doing, which makes sense because these guys are like, say, professors of history and Arabic language and stuff. They're not missionaries. They're not like humanitarians. In the same way, the Ottoman authorities weren't really like you don't have like famine theory to work with. You don't know how to deal with this. So they have like Adam Smith's sort of like, ideas or Malthus's like maniacal misinterpretations of how like economics works. And they tried to fix things in certain ways. And like, say, the fixing of prices, you think it's going to, solve the inflation problem. And when in fact, it just makes things worse. And to some extent, it was just kind of for show. The big thing the Ottomans wanted to do was to keep the state going throughout the war. And if there's any one political decision that I think was, in the overall sense, the fatal one, it was essentially the sacrifice of the well-being of the population to the existence of the state. But if you're a state, you, as an entity, are not going to accept your own dissolution very easily. And so the Ottoman state was quite dysfunctional at the very end. There's something that kind of struck me, I think, as being very sort of like telling about attitudes too. In the Salname, the Bahjat and Tamimi, when they went to the province of Beirut and were like kind of talking to different communities, when they got to the town of Saida, they were asking the leaders about how they were dealing with things, because you have austerity, you're not collecting as much tax revenue, and so like you have to figure out how to adjust how you're going to be like putting budgets together. So they cut a few things that they thought were being unnecessary, one of which actually was charitable giving. So they kept sanitation, they kept education, and they kept, kind of basic sort of kind of maintenance and things like that, and paid the salaries of the employees. But charitable giving was seen as unnecessary in a terrible famine. So, I mean, in these little cases too, you do see the sort of kind of values being kind of influencing the political decision. So it's there, definitely. Yeah.
Sure. Samara.
So speaking of oral history, I've got a friend. She's Beiruti, like a pure Muslim Sunni Beiruti Shahab. And she always told me that she said, like, my grandma told me that she didn't suffer the famine like the people of Mount Lebanon suffered, or the people in South Lebanon, so like in the south, suffered. We didn't add a lot of burghul to our food much. You can tell it from our food. But on the contrary, when I was doing my academic training at Sursuk Museum, the archivist told me that the poor people at some point, when the World War I ended and the famine ended, the poor people were going to Linda Sursuk's palace, and they were throwing tahine, like they were throwing
flour,
and grains at the palace. Like, we don't need your pity, or we don't need your money anymore, or whatever you were giving us anymore. So I have two contradicting perspectives on that. And other than that, to when you were talking about the dying kind of military of the Ottoman Empire in the last stages, I was reading this book where it wasn't documented like that ever. مذكرات عبد الله دبوس ضابط بيروتي في الجيش العثماني. That is like the diaries of someone who was in the military. He is from Beirut, from Dabbous family. You know those small shops, Dabbous, that sells everything you need, like from nails and everything. So that person who started this profession and this kind of shop in Beirut used to be ضابط, like he had a certain military rank in the Ottoman Empire's. You read his diaries?
It's going to be actually it's included in part of my bibliography for my next project.
Okay. Ooh. Okay, next project. I like that. So,
I mean, it's going to be years from now, so don't get too.
But like any glimpses of like the idea, the title, the.
Nothing like that, but it's taking a kind of a continuation of what's happened in the famine and trying to kind of question like it doesn't just end.
Okay.
Like, so what happened afterwards?
Okay, the memory.
What consequences kind of continued on? So this is my main question now.
So because in those diaries, because I just finished reading it yesterday, it's in Arabic. He says descriptively how that he was afraid because he was leading a certain troop, and these troops were basically wearing barely anything with barely any food, and then they had to fight the British army, and some of them were Indians who were really very well fed and very well dressed and everything. So he always mentioned that in a very repetitive manner. So that's just to reconfirm on what you said. And mainly, you mentioned journalism in the book and how it was really very censored during the World War I. And so not everybody got the news that they wanted. And even those who wrote their diaries about the famine were very, sometimes they had a certain goal behind it at the end, especially if they were missionaries. Yeah. So it could really get as subjective as it could be.
Yeah. And I think that the journalism thing is kind of, I think it had more consequences than just like not having access to information. In every country, censors their journalists during the war at this time. But for many of the people, especially like who are, like Lebanon and Syria, is so far from the front lines that like they have no real connection beyond what is coming through. And so what people would do is they would take rumor, and the rumors would be kind of their source of truth. Yeah, exactly. So, but I mean, like, how much can you trust a rumor from someone who's kind of getting it secondhand, third hand, fourth hand, fifth hand? And so the things they would begin to focus on also would begin to shape how people understood the famine. The narrative, like, Edward Nicolay again, was one of the press. He had actually a diary, and diaries are very good because unlike mudhakarat, who have a sort of sense that they're writing this for an audience, a diary is being written for like yourself. Or in the case of Nicolay, for his family. And so he kind of felt like he could be a little bit more honest about things. And he was just report things that were like very sort of like, maybe people might be embarrassed to talk about. Like they might make them sound like a monster. Like, but he would report things that were rumors that were going on. And one of them ones that the Ottomans had colonized Mount Lebanon and done away with its independent status, which is technically true. That 75% of the population of Mount Lebanon had died. And like you just like list out these rumors that were like, yeah, but he is also like, he's like, you couldn't trust them, but at the same time, like this is all you had. So how do you determine what's truth when there's no independent way of confirming this? And if the state tells you something, this is of course politicized as well. So part of, I think, the issue of establishing a narrative of the famine is that there's nothing really like there's nothing so authoritative that you can say that this absolutely happened, apart from like kind of piecing together little bits and pieces. And so I think that this makes it, I think also easier to politicize and also easier to contest, making it so difficult when you're talking about things like, say, how do we talk to children about the famine? Which stories do we use, and what can we trust? And I think the storytelling aspect is the important bit, though, because the stories we choose to tell are important, and they tell us about what we think is important to convey to other people as well. So
I think maybe academically speaking, such a topic could be very much well discussed in a curriculum as the International Baccalaureate curriculum, where it's more inquiry-based than our Lebanese curriculum. Unfortunately, because I taught an IB at an IB school, so I know how inquiry-based learning goes.
Yeah.
It's very much more engaging than the Lebanese curriculum.
I love it. Yeah.
Yeah, you love it too. Thank you.
Guys, we can squeeze in one more question if there's anyone who still wants to ask. No?
Linda?
Okay, Linda Tamim.
You can ask a softball. It's okay. Just give me something like nice and easy.
Well, I'm not very knowledgeable on the subject. I'm ashamed to say, as a Lebanese, you're a lot more knowledgeable than I am when it comes to history and the history of my country. But I would like to ask you if perhaps, I don't know if you tackled this in the talks before I got here, because I arrived late. And it goes in line with the gentleman's question a bit earlier. If perhaps there are signs of trauma from this famine in today's Lebanon and in today's current events. And if you may have some examples that you, I don't know if you've shared those in your books or if you've shared that in the chat earlier before I got here, but if you don't mind sharing those with me again now.
I mean, I think it's a fundamental part of it. Like there's, historians of traumatic events kind of get to the fact that you can't talk about a traumatic event without incorporating some understanding of how it impacts people in a deep level. Because trauma is not something that's rational. It's something that affects us on a personal and emotional level. And I think when we talk about the politics of the famine afterwards and the inability to really decide on like a sort of strong narrative, especially in the sort of wake of the sort of kind of feeling of being targeted, especially by the Maronites in Mount Lebanon, that the trauma is a really fundamental element of that. It makes one defensive and, kind of like, and feel that this is something that has to be respected and understood. But it's also something I think that people, like when they tell stories, it comes out. Like I had a friend, she would hang out with her grandmother, and her grandmother, had been, alive during the famine. Her grandmother used to grab her wrist and put her fingers around it and say, "You never would have lived. You need to eat more." And it's a terrible thing to tell of like a 5-year-old little girl. But you can see in some of the stories like how people kind of carried this onwards. Some of the people who I talked to who are kind of giving their family histories, part of it would be talking about like, say, like children and like, how as a parent do you tell your child that you don't have food for them? And like, how do you distract them in this moment? One of my friends would say like, like my little great aunt would go up to her mom and say like, could you give me like a little sandwich, like just the size of my palm, just like that. And like, it was so cute, but so heartbreaking. Like, and as a parent, she was like, she's never had to do anything like that, to Eli. Like, I couldn't imagine watching him suffer. And this kind of comes out in some of these stories. And over time, I mean, especially generationally, the trauma changes and it passes in different sorts of ways. But I think it's kind of still embedded in which stories we choose to tell and which stories we retain, which stories we, kind of have put down in books to kind of show how horrific sort of things are. So I think it's a really important part of it, actually. And I think actually even going back and trying to find the trauma in the way that the people experienced it, both on the ground and people who suffered and the people who just watched, is something that's really important because that's a big part of the human element of the famine. I think that we need to kind of keep our eyes on. So thank you for that question.
Of course, thanks for answering.
Since it's raining, we can squeeze in another one in case anyone had. Samara, did you have another one? No? Okay. Is William gone? Linda, please.
Sure.
Yeah.
Now it's like coming out. I guess the wine's helping too. No, but since you're also mentioning the Civil War and how usually that's what most people talk about and that's what most people know about in Lebanon, and that's what I guess affected a lot of people, so, ma'am, as you were saying, Tylor, that famine was something that was often not less important, of course, but obviously the Civil War would just overcloud this drastic, horrible event. But I forgot my question right now.
There's a sweet spot with the wine. I think.
Yeah. No,
How
but
do you make children?
yeah. No, but
No, I'm joking. 29. How? Sorry.
in comparison with the Civil War, that trauma, do you think it's less visible in today's Lebanon, or would you say that obviously the Civil War, because more people talk about this today than famine, or would you say that obviously Civil War has a more lasting impact on people?
I mean, I think the Civil War is something that is present in our lives nowadays. You can walk down the street and still see bullet holes everywhere. And the governmental structure and many of the things that Lebanon suffers from nowadays is kind of a holdover from many of the sort of consequences, and then like the snowball effect of those consequences as well. I think the Civil War is inescapable. I think the famine, it was such a terrible time, but the sort of nostalgic era of Lebanese history, the one that everyone kind of forgets that there was like actually poor people in like the golden ages in the 50s and 60s. That all happened in between like the famine and the Civil War and nowadays. So I think that you have enough space and you have enough history that kind of is like it dilutes the famine down to stories to a certain extent, and it's kind of like a very sort of almost like a unified sort of narrative. The horrors of the famine, the individuals who created it, locust, plague, and things like that, and they're there. And in certain parts of the country, it might be more detailed. But in the Civil War, I mean, like it is immediate because so many people were displaced, killed, wounded, emotionally traumatized. I have Lebanese friends in America who left in the 1980s, and they have not come back, and they refuse to bring their kids back because their last image of Lebanon in their minds was a child who had been shot in the head by a sniper hanging out the door of a car like a doll. And he's like that's it. That's where time stopped for him. And that trauma is always going to be something he carries with him. And he's going to some extent, transmit that to his kids because of his own sort of perceptions about the country,
reading this book the last 2 days, I found it to be, it almost fits the landscape. I'm reading it in my apartment, which is damaged from the port blast. It faces the abandoned train depot, that narrow sliver of modernity that stops. It also faces a bunch of trash bins where people are eating from trash.
Yeah.
And then, of course, in the neighborhood, there are still Civil War scars by default.
Yeah.
And you're just reading a book about 100 years ago that feels eerily familiar. A time of collapse, a time of what feels like a battlefield, what looks like a war zone at times.
Yeah.
And it's a story about the end of a long peace. And you have to remind me the name of that author.
Engin Akarla.
Say it again?
Engin Akarla.
I can never say it right. Engin
Akarla.
Nakarla.
Akarla, yeah.
Okay, so that book is the long peace, meaning the Mutasarrifiyya period. This book, in a way, concludes that chapter, and it can look like the last 100 years are stalled. Yeah. Because in 2024, really, sometimes it feels like you're reading about today.
Yeah.
But I think that also adds to your storytelling craft. You're a gifted writer. I can pick up on this easily. Thank you. It goes in the camp of other gifted writers that try to tell the story's history. And I think you did it quite well. So I hope this is back in print in Lebanon soon. In the meantime,
if enough people demand it, I'm sure they'll have to start bringing it in. So
Good. Well, at least online at Aaliya's library, emphasize Aaliya's library, Famine Worlds, Life at the Edge of Suffering in Lebanon's Great War. Tylor Brand, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening and watching. And a friendly reminder to support this podcast by contributing through Patreon or PayPal. All links are in the details box. Until next time, I'm Rani Shatah, and this is the Beirut Banyan.